This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. This is Part 2 of the book. This is Chapter 1 of Part 2, Servants of the Lords. Chapter 1, Journalistic Noblesse, Foreign Correspondence. Among the servants of the press lords, the columnists are the highest paid and rated. They are also the freest, but being syndicated, in most instances, they practically cease being the representatives of a certain paper, or even of a chain, and function as independents. The two highest categories of staff men remain the Washington and the foreign correspondents. These are also well paid, but whereas the Washington correspondent is generally as much a slave of editorial policy as editorial writers at home, the foreign correspondent is without doubt the freest man on any newspaper. Two reasons for this freedom are, A, the general ignorance of the editor and publisher about affairs European, and B, the don't give a damn policy of newspapers about foreign events. Of course, times are changing in journalism as elsewhere, and one cannot accuse the New York Times or the Chicago Daily News foreign services of ever maintaining such an attitude. But it was pretty general when foreign services came into being just after the war. Raymond Graham Swing, who was a foreign correspondent before the war, says that the Chicago Daily News bureaus in Europe were established chiefly to advertise the paper, to furnish a rest room, reading room, and convenient toilet facilities for visiting Chicagoans, and a place to register their names. Swing cabled this list every day. It was his main work. In early 1914 he wrote a series of articles about the war clouds in Europe, practically predicting that war was inevitable before the end of summer. But these stories were cut down until nothing but a sort of tourist guide to interesting capitals remained. When he protested, his editor told him that back in Chicago they considered the whole matter preposterous. They had previously heard nothing about the British, German, and French rearmament programs. They refused to see militarism in the German order for 2 army corps, which was the signal of a coming war, and they did not believe in scaring their readers with bolt-from-the-blue type of stories. Thereby, Swing's reputation as a major prophet was killed a-borning. A great number of the first members of our foreign services were men who had been in the army. Some were excellent journalists, but many were glorified police reporters. On the Chicago Tribune, a premium was actually paid for ignorance. I remember in the early 1920s, when I asked our director why he had chosen Mr. A to succeed me in the capital of X, he replied, quote, "Because A is the only reporter we have who doesn't speak the language. He knows nothing about the country. In fact, he is the only man we have who has never visited Europe. So, you see, he will be unaffected by the propaganda and intrigues of those foreigners. What we want is the real American viewpoint." Unquote. Wow. In the middle 30s, the Mr. A's and their colleagues, whose ignorance of Europe served them so well in the formative days of several American foreign news services, supply the intelligent American's guide to international affairs, combining high adventure, daring-do, and romance with philosophical trimmings by Freud and Steckel, William James and Karl Marx. The world is their oyster cocktail, and the bestseller list their clubroom. In recent years, we have had Vincent Sheehan, once Jimmy to his pals, recounting his personal history, Walter Durante claiming he writes as he pleases, John Gunther telling the inside story of Europe, and Negley Farson confessing his transgressions. And it was not so long ago that H.R. Knickerbocker, Dorothy Thompson, Edgar Ansell, and Paul Scott Maurer, William Henry Chamberlain, Louis Fisher, Eugene Lyons, Anna Louise Strong, and others uttered historical or sensational remarks on Germany and Russia, while Larry Rue, the first foreign correspondent to fly his own airplane, told of Afghanistan, and Mrs. Marguerite Harrison confessed she was an American Secret Service operative while masquerading as representative of the Baltimore Sun and Associated Press. All these men and women were my colleagues. For 15 years I worked with them in Europe, and now as I read their best-selling books, I too am carried away by the excitement, physical or mental, the spirit of adventure, the thrill of history in the making, and at times the tropical romantic pages which have brought such unprecedented popularity to the noblesse of the reportorial profession, the foreign correspondence. If these books affect me in this way, how much more fascinating must they appear to the lay reader? And what a heroic portrait they must give of the authors. Yet, strange as it may sound in realistic days, this nightly stained glass picture is not entirely false. This is the colorful panel begun by Floyd Gibbons in wartime, exhibited on the stage by Sam and Bella Spivak of the old New York World, touched up today by Negley Farson, who might have stepped right out of the crossed works of Richard Harding Davis and O. Henry. In other words, this is the picture of the glorified reporter. Between him and the journalist, there is no sharp way of differentiating, inasmuch as most newspapermen on foreign service go through both phases, sometimes revert, frequently remain both. To illustrate, there was the famous Genoa Conference when the Bolshevik diplomats made their first appearance in Western Europe, in mysterious official silence. Well, there were more than 450 journalists at this conference, most of them in spats and canes, and all of them stood around acting respectfully. But there were 2 New York reporters freshly arrived among them, and they did what every reporter and no journalist would ever do. One of them crashed through the third day's diplomatic parade to the convention hall, seized Chicherin by the coat, and extracted the first interview with a Russian. And the other, by hook or crook, probably the latter, got a world scoop on the Russian-German treaty. For reporters on European service, manners and ethics, unwritten codes and diplomatic protocol are of no more importance than they are at home, and they pursue their prey in the manner they made notorious in the Lindbergh honeymoon affair. In fact, for them, Europe is no more than one glorified police court. But for most of the time, and for the majority of newspaper men abroad, all life is not running to a fire, nor even to a revolution. The reporters, in time, became journalists. The Walter Durante, catapulted out of Cambridge University and the Paris office of the Times into a life of scoops. The Dorothy Thompson of the King Carl of Hungary adventure. The Jimmy Sheehan of the reefy no-man's land inevitably join the non-adventuring Maurers and Chamberlains and Fishers in serious contemplation of the European scene and the prosaic work which marks the journalist as compared to the adventurer reporter. At the risk of destroying all illusions, I have summed up under 7 headings the main activities of practically all American journalists in partibus infidelium. 1. Ear-biting. This is not the most important source of news, but the recommended first step. It consists of getting oriented by pumping dry your colleagues who live in the capital and know the country well, the term ear-biting being the invention, I believe, of that same Mr. Spiewak who broke up the Genoa Conference and retired to Broadway and Hollywood. Parenthesis. Incidentally, the most famous ear-biter in Europe in my time was the journalist Isaac Marcosin, who has glorified for American hero-seekers the 3 leading charlatans of Europe, Hugo Steins, Ivar Kruger, and our old colleague Benito Mussolini. End parentheses. 2. The press of the country. Although some claim only 75%, and others say that 95% of the foreign news sent to America comes out of the newspapers in countries where correspondents are stationed, it is acknowledged that this press is the source of most of it. In Berlin, my assistant and I read 40 papers a day, including the leading Hamburg, Frankfurt, Cologne, Munich, and Dresden dailies, and got most of our news from them. In London, you do not even have to trouble much about translating. 3. News services. Although the Associated Press has tied knots around all the official and semi-official news agencies, that was the plan. Most every journalist buys one or more rival services, and also hires a parliamentary reporter and string men in the provinces, the latter erroneously so-called after the American prototype, who keep a string of their dispatches and are paid space rates. 4. Handouts. Although European governments do not do much handing out of quote-unquote news, a major Washington activity, the press bureaus furnish considerable usable material, obtain statements which later appear as interviews, and generally supply a fair part of your cable crop. 5. Scoops. Bought and paid for. You may remember that Mr. Hearst and one of his reporters, named Horan, were expelled from France after publishing a world scoop about a Franco-British naval agreement. That document was purchased. You will not remember the world scoop on Admiral Scheer's report on the Battle of Jutland to the Kaiser. That item cost me only $50 in gold. Exclusive interviews with Lloyd George at certain times were part of a contract, and once, when I begged Professor Einstein for a statement, he agreed, provided the Tribune donated $25 to the Palestine Fund. Lindbergh and Byrd flew the Atlantic for the Times. King Tut's tomb was opened for the London Times. The first Zeppelin trip to America belonged to the Hearst service, and a dozen of the big stories and scoops of recent times, including Queen Marie, were bought and paid for by the North American Newspaper Alliance. 6. Think pieces. Despite 40 newspapers, the various news services, the bought scoops, and the stuff from the Foreign Office, the time comes frequently, in fact several days a week, when there is no news, or when the situation is in such flux that no definite bulletin news can be made out of it. Whereupon the foreign correspondent sits lightly down and taps 200 or 1,000 words out of his head. These are known as think pieces. The layman can detect them easily by watching for the stock phrases such as, "I learn on good authority," that's a favorite with the British type of journalist, or "In official circles it was said," or "A usually reliable source informs your correspondent," or "In diplomatic circles it was the opinion that," or "Persons close to the government believe," or, when all else fails, and even more anonymous, "It is reported," ... These phrases are not to be confused with, quote-unquote, the official spokesman of the White House, who is usually the President himself. In European dispatches, they may sometimes represent that very minor official who is detailed to the North American division of the Foreign Office, but more likely the qualifying phrases are the self-styled creations of the correspondent himself, and for this very reason they become important. Take, for example, the cables from Mr. Durante. This correspondent has now reached a position when he can put his best pronoun forward and say, "I." But it has been an unwritten rule among American newspapermen to hang the news on someone else. Quote, "No one gives a damn what you think," unquote, is the way one of my editors once put it to me. So you write your own think pieces with the phrase, quote-unquote, "in high circles," and it is immediately regarded with the proper awe by the receiving end. Of course, I cannot tell how many of the Durante cables which contained these qualifying lines were out of high circles and how many out of his mind, but rereading them I find that they were always intelligent, frequently brilliant, and never tendentious. Consider, on the other hand, the think pieces of Mr. Durante's colleague in Rome. Last October, for instance, Mussolini was facing a blockade, whereupon the Cortese think piece informed us that, quote, "The European situation is considered here to have become critical. It is interpreted as evidence that Britain is ready to go to war. The belief that the present deadlock is inevitably leading toward a European war consequently is gaining ground," unquote. Now, this is a fair example of tendentious reporting. It is a think piece, either originated in the Cortese head or planted there by the propagandists of the Foreign Office. Even more tendentious is the July 5th, 1935 cable that, quote, "Official circles scoff the very idea of an economic blockade of Italy," unquote, and, quote, "Other Italian circles are inclined to make light of the British government's reported intention to propose an economic blockade," unquote. And again, quote, "It is not believed by these groups that Britain ever would take the initiative on such dangerous ground," unquote. Of course, what you have here is the typewriter of Cortese, but the voice is that of the Duce. In the view of the fait accompli, these items sound not only ridiculous, but appear reprehensible. 7. quote-unquote original work by native assistants. The foreign correspondent, on taking over a European capital, usually surrounds himself with assistants, American and native. Sometimes the work of the American is signed, but usually it is unsigned, and frequently it is credited to the head of the bureau. Natives, of course, get no recognition. But very often, when there is a scoop or a fine piece of quote-unquote original work produced by one of them, it is blazoned and headlined with the illustrious name of the American correspondent who is the head of the bureau. Parenthesis. Having stated orally for a decade that a large number of my masterpieces were the work of my American assistant, Miss Sigrid Schultz, I now hastened belatedly to say so in print, end parenthesis. These 7 headings, I believe, account for 90% of the time and work of a foreign correspondent. They place him heavily at a desk in an office, reading newspapers, watching the news ticker, or the flimsy brought in from the news bureau, dickering with some notable over the price of a scoop, editing the translated pieces, rewriting the stories supplied by assistants and natives, and writing quote-unquote situation stories, which may be intelligent or vicious propaganda, depending upon the many factors which cannot be detailed here. At any rate, this 90% of the journalist's life is routine work, leaving only 10% for war, revolution, coup d'etat, violence, and romantic adventure, which occupy 90% of the volumes of personal history, memoirs, and autobiography, which in the course of time make their bestseller appearances. Very naturally, their authors are too good judges of human interest to ask their readers to spend time on the dull, everyday office work, when there is so much to tell about kings and dictators, rebels and charlatans, plots, the rise and fall of dynasties, the armed march of economic and social philosophies, the thrilling tithe of the harvest of the years. This is what the life of foreign correspondence has been like ever since the great expansion, which occurred during and as a result of the World War. Up to that time, the few who comprised the Corps, outside the news agency men, were considered a luxury. But in 1919, not only all the New York morning newspapers, but the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Daily News, Christian Science Monitor, and Philadelphia Ledger extended or established services, and the Brooklyn Eagle, Baltimore Sun, Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, Newark News, and other important papers sent one or more permanent correspondents to Europe. While it is true that not many of these men and women who became the nobility of American journalism were chosen originally because of their ignorance and provincialism, as in the case of my successor at X, it is equally true that few of us were especially fitted for the job. Several of us were accidents. We were in the army, or we happened to be in Europe, or we pulled the best strings in the Home Office because we considered the foreign assignment an adventure or good fun, or a chance to see the world on an expense account. There were few Maurers, Durantes, and Chamberlains among the lot, more Gibbonses and Roos and Farsons. The majority, it is safe to say, were reporters, not journalists, and we never had a thought in the world outside the production of news. Parenthesis. I speak, of course, for only the 20 capitals where I have been stationed. End parenthesis. Some of my colleagues drank themselves to death. Several reformed. Some made love to each other's wives. One committed suicide. Several were married and divorced or psychoanalyzed. Most of them shot dice and played poker. One made a fortune in foreign real estate. 2 wrote poetry. 1 collected shoes. Nearly all tried their hands at plays and novels. In short, they were very much the same group as the American diplomatic, consular, military, and commercial groups to be found in all foreign countries. They were no more cowardly or bold than other workmen who live in economic insecurity, although they gave a swaggering appearance of brave freedom. Because Europe is terra incognita, because the owners of the papers are ignorant about Europe and careless, they rarely instruct the foreign correspondents as they do the Washington or local men. The journalists, therefore, do much as they please. For some years, one I know glorified fascism, and later his successor attacked fascism, and it was not until the Roosevelt administration made America cognizant of that word that the publisher noticed this little matter. Up to recently, Bolshevism alone, among foreign happenings, received any attention from the newspaper proprietors. It was recognized early as a threat to possessions and profits, and every newspaper worker who could see on which side his bread was buttered 3,000 miles away knew how to handle that subject. If he was so dumb as to think he could treat Bolshevism as fairly as other European phenomena, as one of my colleagues did, he soon found out better. The gentleman in question had been converted after 3 months at the shrine of Lenin, and reconverted almost instantaneously at the Western Union cable office in Paris at 4 p.m. on a tepid August afternoon. Generally speaking, the majority of foreign correspondents in my time were men who took no sides, who did quote-unquote straight reporting, spent most of their time in their offices, wrote few think pieces, kept themselves neutral in all political storms, never entered entangling alliances, except amorous, in European countries, and maintained pretty well the American provincial attitude of sneering down upon everything foreign. If, in the early days, the correspondents made trips to Rome or Moscow, the result might well have been headed, "The Richard Harding Davis Boys Discover Fascism," or "The Richard Harding Davis Boys Inside the Kremlin." But reading the numerous important and valuable books of the foreign correspondents, it is apparent that everything is different now. Obviously, and almost without exception, the men who have been cabling about Bolshevism and fascism, the collapse of the capitalist system, wars and revolutions, have really been thinking about them. They seem suddenly to have discovered that there are economic forces at work in a world whose adventurous surface they have reported. They not only have found a social conscience loose in Europe, but they seem to have sounded themselves and also found it within. They have apparently advanced from reporters of symptoms to interpreters of cause and effect, at least in their books. Rather than explain this phenomenon, I would just welcome it as another sign of the times, another proof that the first to recognize a sinking social system and move to higher ground is the intelligent minority. But this much I must say, that although from 1917 to just recently the foreign correspondents never appeared to have been shaken by the cataclysmic Karl Marxian thunders, they were never in their lives misled by the false summer lightnings of the shyster professional economists who wrote pieces to the publishers' orders for their daily newspapers at home. Whereas here in America the left still shouts to the writers, "Descend from your ivory towers," in Europe nowadays there is no longer the call to the journalists, "Beat it out of the Adlon bar." The journalistic noblesse seems to have come of age since that day when the linguistically crippled, the socially irresponsible, the economically illiterate were thought the best representatives in foreign lands, and when Ring Lardner was sent by his Chicago newspaper to write, quote, "the comic side of the World War," unquote. Whoa, man, that is really irreverent. Scandalous there. A comic side of a world war. Okay, folks, that has been Chapter 1 of Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. We will be back with Chapter 2 of Part 2 in a few moments. We're back for Part 2, Chapter 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Part 2, Chapter 2, The Washington Galley Slaves. Like the foreign correspondent, the Washington representative of a newspaper is privileged to write think pieces. He is, in the nation's capital, not merely to report actual happenings, the news services will see to that, but to interpret events for all the people. In other words, the Washington correspondent is really a semi-editorial writer. And, since no owner would appoint a man to Washington unless he could rely upon him to continue the home editorial policy, and because the correspondents know that they cannot write contrary to the social, political, and economic prejudices or philosophies of their bosses, and get away with it for long, it had become an accepted supposition in the trade that the Washington correspondents were servile, contented galley slaves, sycophants, the worst yes-men of all. But apparently times have changed in Washington, just as they have in the Foreign Service. In the 1936 campaign, the lay reader might have found cause for thought in the report, made in a Democratic Party paper, of course, that the overwhelming majority of the correspondents traveling with both Landon and Roosevelt, most of them writing Republican or pro-Landon news, would vote for the re-election of the president, parenthesis. In New York at the time, it was reported that almost the entire Herald Tribune staff would vote for the man this paper was attacking, end parentheses. The reader might have wondered how it was possible to write one way and vote another. At the same time, liberal leaders and the liberal weeklies were hinting that Washington correspondents were the most biased of all reporters, and the great publishers were replying that no bias could be found in their papers except in the editorial page. Newspapermen themselves were not fooled. They knew that most Washington news is cut to fit editorial policy, that despite the fact the capital representative is quote-unquote reliable, and would not openly or subversively write the truth in defiance of his boss, there are nevertheless numerous instances of distortion and suppression of their telegrams, that news is frequently colored, sometimes faked in the Home Office, and that a great number of Washington correspondents are cynics who do not themselves believe in much of the bunkum they send and which their publishers use to fool the American people. The profession has always known that. But there has been no scientific test of this common knowledge until Leo C. Roston, emulating the Linns, who wrote their magnificent study of small-town life in Middletown and Middletown in transition, went to Washington on a 2-year grant from the Social Science Research Council and emerged with his book, The Washington Correspondence. It is not merely another book about newspaper writers, nor is it merely a documented study of the situation in journalistic Washington. It is the most illuminating inside story of a newspaper corps ever made. It is partly an indictment of newspapers and publishers. It is partly an exposé of how the nation is fed political dope. It is without a doubt the most illuminating light ever cast upon the human forces which, through journalism, direct the political thinking of the United States. This investigation knocks into a Cockney derby the publisher's claim that editorializing and coloring is confined to the editorial page, and that the news columns are quote-unquote free. It supplies the documentary proof that 1. Either the Washington correspondents themselves distort the news, or 2. That their news is distorted by order in the home offices. The study of the Washington Press Corps was made largely through a series of questionnaires submitted by Mr. Roston. Here is a sample question and result. He asked, "What is the most fair and reliable newspaper in America?" 99 Washington correspondents answered. The great majority did not include the newspaper for which they worked among the fair and reliable ones. The poll showed New York Times, 64 first choices, 16 second, 9 third, or 89 mentions, scoring 747 points and winning by a mile. Baltimore Sun, 284 points in show. Christian Science Monitor, 90 points in place. Scripps Howard Papers, 85 points. St. Louis Post-Dispatch, 84 points. The present writer cannot quite figure out the vote for the St. Louis Dispatch, which has always been considered one of the most fair and honest papers in America, and which has frequently been given first place in lay and journalistic polls. But when it comes to the vote on the least fair and reliable newspapers in the United States, the vote is startling. 93 Washington correspondents were willing to go on record on this one, and the vote was Hearst newspapers, 59 first choice, 20 second, and 8 third, making 714 points. Chicago Tribune, 24 first mentions, 37 second, 10 third, or 455 points. Los Angeles Times, 103 points. Next in order were Scripps Howard Papers, Denver Post, New York Herald Tribune, and Washington Post. The amazing thing was that the entire Hearst Press, which consists of 24 newspapers throughout the country, should have been so universally condemned as comprising the worst papers in America. Another outstanding fact is that the Washington correspondents were unanimous in naming the 3 leading reactionary, red-baiting papers as the 3 most unfair and most unreliable. Perhaps this, too, was a coincidence. Another sensational disclosure regarding Hearst news in general was the voting on press agencies. 97 journalists were willing to go on record as to their choice among the Associated Press, United Press, i.e. Scripps Howard, International News Service, i.e. Hearst, and Universal Service, i.e. Hearst, and this was the result. United Press, number of votes, 49.4%. Associated Press, 44 votes, 45.3%. Hearst's International News Service, 4 votes, 4.1%. Hearst's Universal Service, 1 vote, 1%. This shows, strangely enough, that the United Press, which is a private business concern, and therefore might naturally run its news service to suit its owners, is considered better than the Associated Press, which is the great cooperative of the American newspaper publishers, and which is supposed to be more honest than Caesar's wife, and a darn sight more virtuous. This vote was followed by another. Why did the correspondents prefer the stories of one or the other press services? Because they are written better, more reliable, more liberal. The vote was United Press, 42 votes for better written, 19 votes for more reliable, 27 votes for more liberal. Associated Press, 5 votes for better written, 43 votes for more reliable. International News, 3 votes for better written, 4 votes for more reliable. Universal Service, 1 vote for better written. This brings up an amusing conclusion. There was 1 vote for Hearst's Universal Service in the table on preferences, which may have been that of the universal correspondent. But when it comes to expressing reliability, the lonesome voter, who in the table sticks to his own outfit under the heading Better Written, can't go the more reliable column. The important fact, however, is the vote on more liberal. 27 correspondents vote for the United Press, but not 1 vote is cast for the Associated Press, the supposedly most impartial and objective agency. The author, in a footnote, explains that 9 AP men, 7 UP, 5 INS, and 2 Universal Servicemen were sent his questionnaire, and this adds to the amusing conclusion that Hearst representatives voted pretty consistently against the Hearst outfit in all departments. What are the politics of the newspaper correspondents of Washington, whose writings considerably affect the political thinking of the nation? Despite the fact the great majority of papers were bitterly anti-Roosevelt, the Washington correspondents were for Roosevelt. Of 85 who answered the question, 63.5% declared they were voting for the president. In other words, a large part, if not the majority, of the Washington Corps was writing pro-Landon news for pro-Landon newspapers and voting pro-Roosevelt. Only 21% believed in the old program of rugged individualism. 80% voted for some form of government control of big business. 67%, quote, favor higher taxes on the upper income brackets, unquote. Good luck on that one. 5 questions dealing with the press in general were put, and the answers constitute an indictment of the publishers by their employees. 1. Does the press devote too much space to trivialities, scandal, sensations, divorce, etc.? Yes, voted more than 60% of the 104 who answered. 9.6% were undecided. 2. Is it true that the newspapers fail to give significant accounts of the nation's basic economic conflicts? Here the vote of condemnation was 86.6%. 3. Quote, in general, news columns are equally fair to big business and labor, unquote. This was the third statement the correspondents were asked to check, and 48.5% replied that this statement was false, because the press was generally on the side of big business, as against labor, while 43.8% thought the press was impartial, and 7.6% could not make up their minds. 4. The reader may remember the old Blue Eagle, the famous or infamous NRA, the great days of the parades and the codes, and the decision of the Supreme Court which ended that dramatic and colorful episode in our history. The newspaper code was the one on which the President stumbled. Up to then, the going was unimpeded. The newspapers raised the issue of freedom of the press, claiming that while codes are all right in the chicken business, parenthesis, which proved just the reverse later, end parenthesis, they were not to be thought of in publishing. Listen, then, to how the Washington Press Corps played its part during the code battle. Mr. Austin says, quote, some of the correspondents acted as agents for their publishers in getting information, sounding out opinions, suggesting to congressmen what the preferences of the publishers were. Many of them were under an obligation to sound the freedom of the press alarm. Many believed the code was bad. How did the correspondents themselves feel about the publishers' stand on the issue? Unquote. He put the question to them. Quote, the publishers cry freedom of the press in fighting an NRA code. Was it a ruse? Unquote. 105 replied. 67 journalists, or 63.8%, agreed that their employers had hurled a dead cat, set up a straw man, pulled a Charlie McCarthy, put over one big bluff on the country. Only 24.7% thought no hoax was planted, no skullduggery practiced. 12 men were uncertain. This is probably the most self-revealing statement of the great political press corps of America, and one of the most appalling indictments of the newspaper publishers. 5. Related to the foregoing question was one asking whether the newspaper press of America published fair or distorted stories about the Tugwell Pure Food and Drug Bill. This measure, it may be remembered, was largely an effort to compel manufacturers or processors of food and drugs to advertise them as carefully as they labeled them. Under the Harrison Pure Food and Drug Bill of 1906. It is no secret that the newspapers knifed and murdered this bill, and knifed Mr. Tugwell as well. But while the newspapers universally denounced the measure, their foremost writers, the Washington correspondents, voted 46.2% to the effect that their newspapers were unfair and distorted the news about it. Only 21.6% thought the Tugwell story honestly handled, and 32% were uncertain, the first instance when more than a dozen or so were not sure about the journalistic situation. Is the news colored? 60% of the correspondents admitted that they were aware of the definite fixed quote-unquote policy of their newspapers. A fraction of a point over 60% agreed that, quote, my orders are to be objective, but I know how my paper wants stories played, unquote. This does not mean, Mr. Ralston hastens to add, that, quote, all the correspondents in Washington are the tools of their publishers. Policy is rarely enforced by policy orders from the Home Office. The policy of a newspaper is maintained through less conscious and more subtle channels, through a choice of personnel, through subjective adjustments on the part of reporters, and through the institutionalization of a scale of values within the organization. As a human being, the reporter adjusts himself to the tastes of other human beings who pass judgment upon his work, unquote. Have stories been, quote, played down, cut, or killed for policy reasons, unquote? Of 72 who replied, 40, or 55.5%, said yes. 30, or 41.6%, said no, and only 2 were uncertain. Policy means many things, but it does not mean truth. One correspondent explained he watched how stories were played up and revised his quote-unquote slant on the news accordingly. The statement was made that it was impossible to be objective when one read the editorials in his own paper and sensed its policy. 60% voted this true. But worse yet, there were specific instances when correspondents got their orders to color the news. Many are quoted. 1. Quote, don't forget, we are backing Al Smith, unquote, said an editor's telegram sending its Washington correspondent on an, quote-unquote, objective tour of the East. 2. Publishers instructed their Washington men to fight the pink slip law on income taxes. 3. 8 correspondents confessed they wrote, quote-unquote, around the Tugwell story, owing to publisher opposition. 4. A correspondent wrote an unbiased story about war bonuses and pensions. It was returned with the comment that the paper was supporting the bonus. He changed it to say veterans' demands were, quote, in the American tradition, unquote. This story was accepted. 5. A correspondent was asked by telephone if certain facts were true. He replied they were not. The Home Office kept on insisting and questioning until, he confesses, quote, I strained the facts, unquote, and wrote the story the other way. 6. A correspondent was told, quote, not to crusade, unquote, when he wrote a story which had implications the paper did not want. 7. An editor explaining why a story was killed said it was, quote-unquote, unwise to publish it, but did not deny its truth, timeliness, etc. 8. A foreign correspondent's cable from Hungary was rejected because, quote, it does not reflect Midwestern opinion on this point, unquote. 9. 3 correspondents wrote an honest report on ethyl gasoline. 2 newspapers killed it. The third eliminated the name of Standard Oil. The interested reader will do well to get the Washington Correspondence and study it page by page. It is one of the most revealing documents of our time. It adds a stream of gasoline to the fire which is burning throughout the country, the fire of doubt about everything that appears in the press. I wish there was more of that today. After all, the Washington Press Corps is the elite. Its integrity is of the highest, and yet it confesses the fact that the political news of America is colored, distorted, played up, played down, perverted, suppressed, and sometimes completely falsified. This testimony gives the bum rush to that famous phrase of the newspaper publishers of America, freedom of the press. It ties the can to the code of ethics of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. It exposes the American Newspaper Publishers Association completely, scientifically, without prejudice, with great objectivity. And that concludes chapters 1 and 2 from Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. You've been listening to Rejected Knowledge.